Good afternoon, all. My name is Amber Canto, and I am the Director of the Health and Wellbeing Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. We are so pleased to have you join us for today's webinar, COVID-19, a conversation about vaccines. We have two very special guests with us today who will be helping answer your questions about COVID-19 vaccines and vaccination. Next slide. Dr. Ajay Sethi is Associate Professor in Population Health Sciences and an infectious disease epidemiologist. He is also Faculty Director of the Master of Public Health program and a 2021 recipient of a Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award. Dr. Devlin Cole is a PGY2 Preventive Medicine resident at UW-Madison. She earned her MD from Case Western Reserve University and her MPH in epidemiology from the University of California, San Diego. She completed her internship in pediatrics in Honolulu, where she implemented the ACIP childhood vaccination program in her patient population. She also spent time in Oslo at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, learning about vaccine ordering, distribution, registry, and adverse event tracking. There, she was also able to spend time at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, Innovations, learning about the global partnership between public, private, philanthropic, and civil society organizations to accelerate the development of vaccines. She's been helping the Wisconsin Department of Health Services to staff the State Disaster Medical Advisory Committee Subcommittee on COVID-19 vaccine allocation since November 2020. She's also one of two physicians leading the effort for the University Health Services at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Next slide. Before we get started with today's content, just a few notes on housekeeping items. All mics are muted. Please use the Q&A function for questions that you would like to have answered. The chat feature allows you to send questions to specific individuals. If you've got a tech issue, please chat Chelsea Severin. For each presenter, we will spotlight the videos of the presenter and the interpreter so you can see them in addition to the slideshow. We will address questions at the end, but feel free to send them at any time during the presentation. And a recording of this webinar will be posted for viewing following the session on Extension's COVID response page. All registered participants will be notified of the recording and additional resources next week. Next slide. One final reminder, please choose your language of preference during today's webinar. And again, the instructions to do so are on the screen. We'll begin with an outline today of the basic overview of vaccines, introduce the approved COVID-19 vaccines, and establish the public health implications for COVID-19 vaccination. We'll then go deeper into developing an understanding of how the COVID-19 vaccines were developed and authorized, and how distributions are occurring in Wisconsin. We'll then round out with a question and answer session, and without additional delay, we'll get started with our content. I'll turn it over now to Dr. Sethi.
Thank you, Amber. I appreciate the invitation to be here. So I'm going to provide an overview of vaccines, strategies used to develop them, and then talk about current and upcoming COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide. Viruses and bacteria are germs, and many germs are important for our health and survival, like the bacteria in our guts. Some germs cause disease and harm our health, and sometimes the disease can be quite severe or even fatal in children, in adults, or people of all ages. Now listed here are some germs and the diseases they cause. For most of the diseases listed, we have vaccines. Measles, the tetanus shot, HPV, chickenpox, and the shingles, and now COVID-19. Developing a vaccine for HIV has been very challenging. Just imagine for a moment how many lives around the world could have been improved and saved if we were to have a safe and effective HIV vaccine. Now, governments and society have always invested in research and development of vaccines for diseases that cause a great deal of illness and premature death. The new COVID-19 vaccines, in fact, are evidence of what a massive investment can do. Investments from the US and other governments, from universities, from domestic and international organizations, from industries. But the COVID-19 vaccines are not a product of investments made in 2020 alone. We have effective vaccines for COVID-19 because of decades of work done by scientists that was shared and passed on to other scientists to use when faced with new challenges. The goal of a vaccine is to stimulate the immune system to produce antibodies and other types of immune responses. The goal is to build immunity without getting the disease itself. Let's distinguish vaccines from treatment. Treatments aim to alleviate symptoms and the negative consequences of a disease, while vaccines aim to prevent diseases altogether. Many vaccines use an approach that has been around for a long time. You can take a germ and weaken it, or maybe inactivate it, using a chemical process. By giving a person the architecture of the entire germ, you give the immune system many targets for which to build immunity. It's a common approach, but it requires that you grow the virus in a lab, and that is not always easy. If we need to vaccinate millions, even billions of people around the world, you have to grow a large amount of virus. There is always scientific and public interest to minimize the components of a vaccine. And this is where immunologists can tell us where to focus. For SARS-CoV-2, the spike protein is a key protein for which you want antibodies. For hepatitis B, only a subunit of the virus is given, a protein that is on the surface of the virus. To avoid having to grow hepatitis B virus, in the 1970s and 1980s, yeast cells were genetically modified to produce hepatitis B surface protein in large quantities. Even today, we use genetically modified yeast cells to make many drugs that are used in medicine. Now, hepatitis B vaccine was the first subunit vaccine and was developed in 1981. The more recent shingles vaccine is also a subunit vaccine. The HPV vaccine was the first vaccine to use viral-like particles, which are synthetic nanoparticles. They are made in a lab and contain some of the key proteins of HPV. These tiny particles are not infectious and they do not produce disease. Now, a viral vector, listed next, is like a Trojan horse. You take a different virus, one that is not capable of multiplying, and engineer it to deliver key components of a germ to stimulate a person's immune system. For Ebola, for example, you can imagine how the public will be more accepting of this particular platform over a strategy that took actual Ebola virus and inactivated it. Researchers working on COVID-19 vaccines have been using all of these platforms. The two COVID-19 vaccines authorized for use by the FDA right now are RNA vaccines. Before I talk about that more, take a look at the image on the right of this slide. So in our cells, DNA is found in the nucleus, separated from the rest of a cell. And as you know, DNA contains the building blocks of life. Our cells have a process to reproduce DNA for when our cells multiply. We also have a process to read the codes in DNA to produce molecules called messenger RNA. mRNA contains the code to produce proteins. And of course, these proteins will perform many vital functions in our body to allow us to live and to thrive. A virus also has genetic code to reproduce itself, but viruses are not cells. They are parasites. They need to find a person, infect their cells, and hijack the cell's machinery to multiply itself. Now, SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus. When the cells in our lungs are infected with the coronavirus, it begins to produce viral proteins and eventually new viral particles that make their way into our respiratory droplets so that they can be passed on to another person, unsuspecting person. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are RNA vaccines. Messenger RNA is a fragile molecule and degrades rather easily. To stabilize it and to deliver it to our cells, Moderna and Pfizer inserted the RNA into a lipid nanoparticle. These lipid nanoparticles are basically tiny fat droplets. The mRNA code does not come from the coronavirus. It is made in a lab and it provides cells the instructions to make spike protein and only the spike protein. The technology to make tiny pieces of messenger RNA is not new and has been around for decades. When we are given these vaccines, a shot in the arm basically, cells begin to produce the spike protein. And our immune systems then begin to develop antibodies and other types of immunity to the spike protein. There are other strategies used for COVID-19 vaccines. Johnson & Johnson uses an adenovirus viral vector to deliver the messenger RNA to our cells. And adenovirus vectors are also not new. They have been also used for decades. Novavax is also using lipid nanoparticles, but instead of delivering RNA, lab-made spike proteins are attached to the outside of these lipid nanoparticles. Let's take a look at 5 COVID-19 vaccines. Pfizer and Moderna, in the green rows, were authorized by the FDA in December and are being rolled out across the country right now. The Johnson & Johnson, Novavax, and AstraZeneca vaccines will officially be reviewed by the FDA in the near future. Only the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a single-dose vaccine. The others are 2-dose vaccines given 3 or 4 weeks apart. In order to determine whether a vaccine works to prevent COVID-19, you have to do a randomized controlled clinical trial. In 2020, hundreds of thousands of people across the country and world volunteered to participate in these clinical trials and many clinical studies before them to help the effort to get a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine to our society. The UW-Madison is a study site for the Oxford AstraZeneca clinical trial. In a clinical trial, half of the volunteers are randomly given the vaccine being studied. The other half is randomly given a placebo. You follow all of the individuals over time, and periodically you calculate the rate of the outcome of interest in the 2 arms of the study. Effectiveness is then estimated using the formula you see on this slide. Essentially, we are estimating how much disease can be reduced if individuals are given the vaccine. Next slide. The COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials were designed to see if the vaccines can prevent illness and not infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The outcomes were predefined as the ones listed here. So getting mild or moderate symptoms, having severe disease, being hospitalized, and death. Let me digress for a moment. Imagine shopping for a pair of jeans, and the regular price is $100, not cheap. If the jeans were on sale for $75, we can calculate the savings as 25% off. Not bad. For COVID-19 vaccines, the government and our society decided in advance that if we could produce a vaccine that was at least 50% effective, then the investment and effort would be worth it. Also, you are more likely to buy that pair of $100 jeans if it were $50 than if it were $75. 2 doses of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were found to be 95% and 94% effective in preventing COVID-19 symptoms. So those expensive genes are now only $5. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a 1-dose vaccine and is less effective, 66%, but still well above the 50% level that would make this vaccine worth using. And a single-dose vaccine is much easier to roll out. It's also a vaccine that can be kept in the refrigerator and does not need to be frozen. Johnson & Johnson is doing studies to see if 2 doses improve the effectiveness. The Novavax vaccine was found to be 89% effective in the United Kingdom, where the UK variant circulates. So that's good news. In South Africa, the effectiveness is less at 50 to 60%. I'm not showing those numbers on this slide because those data, which were released recently, is from smaller studies and not the large clinical trial that was done in the United Kingdom. For all of these vaccines, the effectiveness in preventing severe disease if infected with SARS-CoV-2 is higher than their effectiveness to prevent symptoms. That is why it is worth getting any of the vaccines when offered to you. They are all excellent in preventing people from being hospitalized and preventing people from dying from the infection. If you catch the virus despite being vaccinated, you may develop symptoms, but they are likely to be mild and last for only a few days. Next slide. I must say, science is amazing. The first case of COVID-19 was reported to the World Health Organization on December 31st, 2019. On January 10th, 2020, scientists from China made available to the world the sequence of the novel coronavirus, which we now call SARS-CoV-2. By December 8th of last year, 91-year-old Margaret Keenan in the United Kingdom became the first person in the world to receive the Pfizer vaccine as part of a mass vaccination program. In between these 2 dates, a tremendous effort took place, which Dr. Cole will talk about in more detail. Although RNA vaccines are new, the science behind them are decades old and can be traced back to pioneering work done right here at UW-Madison. In 1990, John Wolfe and colleagues showed that you can inject RNA strands into the cells of a mouse and proteins could be produced. They published that work in the journal Science. Dr. Wolfe was a physician scientist who sadly passed away in April of last year after a long battle with cancer. In his 1990 paper, you can see that he certainly knew the significance of his research, proposing that a study could lead to an alternative approach to vaccine development. And here we are 30 years later with 2 RNA vaccines for COVID-19. Finally, I will close with 3 important points. First, recognize that COVID-19 vaccines to date prevent symptoms and severe disease, but we are still learning about how well they prevent transmission. As a result, we must continue with mitigation as the vaccine is rolled out. Mask use, physical distance, hand hygiene are all effective in preventing transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Mitigation also prevents new variants from emerging. As long as we allow the virus to multiply and spread in the community, we are giving it an opportunity to continue to evolve. Through that viral evolution, we can expect other new variants to emerge, ones for which our vaccines may not be effective, underlying the importance to speed up our rollout of the vaccine and the importance that people accept getting the vaccine when offered to them. Thank you.
Unmuting, sorry. Hi, I'm Dr. Cole. I'm honored to be speaking to you guys in this space. With my time, I'm going to try to answer some of the most common questions that I've been hearing. And the first of which is, how can the vaccine be safe if it was made so quickly? So as you've just heard, all of this amazing vaccine technology is already available to us. So the short answer is, we cut out the waiting time and the red tape. And you can see this kind of a flow. I've cut it in half so that it fits better on the slide. But actually our work, our preclinical work, was able to be done before the United States went into lockdown. So we were entering phase 1 human clinical trials in mid-March. This was also made possible because we threw a lot of money at it. Operation Warp Speed in the United States had $10 billion of funding made available immediately. We also were investing in a lot of different vaccine technologies at the same time, knowing that it was okay if some failed. Our goal was to have some succeed and enough succeed that we can get the vaccines to people, which is where we are right now. So it's exciting. And this is a known strategy. We were buying syringes and glass vials while we were still trying to get people to come in for those medical trials. And the companies were manufacturing millions of vials that had not yet been approved, which was a gamble, but one that's paying off right now. Next slide. So who was included in the trials? Phase 1 trials, they're very small. They tend to be less than 100 people, and they really are focusing on dosing sizes and making sure that there are not any significant bad outcomes. So when there are not bad outcomes observed, we were able to scale up to phase 2 very quickly, which is hundreds of people. We're still looking at side effects, but now we actually want to see an immune response. Does the vaccine do what we want it to do? And when we see that response, we can immediately scale up to phase 3. This is thousands of people and sites around the world. And it was really focusing on, does the vaccine perform compared to a placebo? So some people were receiving shots that had nothing inside, and we could compare them. This was also the point where we really had intention to include a lot of diversity. We knew that COVID-19 was affecting disproportionately older people, causing mortality, and different ethnic groups within the United States specifically. So we had a lot of diversity in those trials. We were looking for an emergency use authorization, which is given by the FDA, and it's not a full approval. It's different. They are really balancing the risks versus the benefits and making sure that in extenuating circumstances such as a global pandemic, there are enough benefits and there are not a lot of risks to go ahead forward to put it into millions of arms, even though technically we've not seen those 1 in a million reactions. So we may only be seeing them as it rolls out into the general population. I'm going to note here that we did not include children in these trials. Pfizer went down to 16 and did present that data to the FDA, so that's why their approval is down to 16. Moderna included 16-year-olds, but only as of December, so their data was not presented to the FDA. Both of those companies are now enrolling down to 12. And generally the pattern across the board for all of the different types of vaccines is that they will go down to 12, then they will do 6 to 12-year-olds, then they will do 2 to 6-year-olds. And similar to the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, they will use smaller doses, quarter doses, half doses, and even full doses to see what the right dosing is going to be for those kids. We're also we don't have data on pregnant women, and I'm going to talk about that at the end because I know that's a question that comes up a lot. So you can go to the next slide. So a question I get a lot is, who can get the vaccine right now? And how did we decide that order? And there's both a federal answer to that question and a state answer to that question. So the federal answer to that question comes from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which gives recommendations to the CDC. And they were using 3 major principles: scientific evidence, ethical principles, and feasibility. They also had 2 kind of different tiers that they were working with at the same time. They wanted to target older individuals to prevent mortality, but at the same time, they wanted to target younger individuals to get society back to functioning. So that's how we got in Tier 1A, residents of long-term care facilities, and we also got healthcare workers. So you'll see those kind of 2 tandem groups in each of the different phases. So as you can see on this slide, this is actually from the state of Wisconsin. There are different rollout strategies, and each state is in a different place in their rollout, depending on their allocation and the populations that they've been able to get the shots in the arms to. So we are part of the way through 1B, including police, fire, and non-EMS responders, and also those over 65, which is a federal guideline that we are following. In our algorithms, we do give a bonus to vaccinating entities. They get a little bit larger orders filled if they are providing vaccines to places with lower social vulnerability index, populations that may have been overlooked or are suffering more from the burden of COVID-19. There's also a benefit, at least in 1A, if healthcare entities were able to vaccinate outside of their immediate employer population. So if a hospital was able to vaccinate some of the EMS ambulance workers, even though they weren't directly employed by them, they may get a little bit of extra vaccine as a bonus. Also, I should mention, all of the arrows continue across. This is like getting called at a buffet at a wedding. Once your table is called, it will always be called. You can always go up and get it. You're not going to miss your window. We can go to the next slide. So what is the vaccine order and delivery process? I'm going to take you through a typical week in the life of a DHS worker / a vaccinating entity. The DHS, so the state of Wisconsin, gets its allocations on a week-by-week basis. Hopefully that will stretch out in the future as the supply becomes more stable. But on Monday, DHS sends out a survey to all of the vaccinating entities and say, how many vaccines do you think you can give out next week? And those entities need to have that answer by Tuesday, and they email them back. On Wednesday, DHS uses that algorithm with those kind of extra bonuses in and a guess of how many vaccines they're going to get allocated, and they make an estimate of who's going to get how much. They then place their orders with the federal government on Thursday and Friday. The federal government gets back to them and tells them how many they'll have. Over the weekend, there's the mad scramble to tell the vaccinating entities, this is what you're going to get, and this is the day you can expect it. On Monday, the start of the new week, they get delivered. Sometimes they come directly from the manufacturers. So if it's coming from Pfizer, it's at -80 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's coming from McKesson, which is the Moderna distributor here in the United States, it's a little bit less cold. Or it may be coming from a hub. We have a hub and spoke model with deep cold freezers at certain locations around the state. And this is how we really are making a push to get to those rural areas that don't necessarily have the infrastructure to handle a whole lot of vaccine at once. Because it should be noted that once they get that vaccine, especially Pfizer, has a very short shelf life. You are working with 5 days to get that shot in an arm. And it's 30 days for Moderna. Okay, you can move on. So as you can see on this slide, the Department of Health is keeping track very closely of all of its vaccines. It updates this screen, which you can find. It's publicly available on their website. It updates it pretty much every week, although the administered doses is really updated every day. And we have a pretty good percentage of the ordered vaccines administered. So there's always places that we can improve. There's always cutting down the transit time, cutting down the administration time. But it's not as dire as some of the statistics might seem, depending on how you're calculating things out. So we can go to the next slide. How will I get my vaccine? This is a really good question, and it depends on what population you're in, to be honest. So some of the populations in the state of Wisconsin are actually going to be in the federal supply. If you are a veteran, if you work for the United States Postal Service, if you are on a Native American tribal lands, each tribe gets to choose whether they're using the state supply or whether they're going through the Indian Health Service. Even if you're not in those special populations here in Wisconsin, there may still be a population bias for where you're getting yours. Pharmacies right now are being tapped as major providers in the future, which is great. The Biden administration is continuing the pattern that the Trump administration had for tying in federal pharmacy programs. But currently in Wisconsin, we're still fairly healthcare provider based. and your local public health department may also be offering these vaccines. So it sort of depends. I will say, try to get your second dose at the same place where you got your first dose. All of the second doses are being counted and allocated by the state in general to where the first doses are. So swapping around locations makes planning very difficult. That being, along those same lines, also try to get the second dose to be the same brand as the first dose. Technically, the CDC did come out and say in extremely extenuating circumstances, you can mix 1 dose of Pfizer with 1 dose of Moderna, but that is not the recommendation. We have no science to support that right now. We have no FDA approved testing. So try to get your same brand and at the same location. You can move forward. So that leads to the question, which vaccine should I get? Whichever one you can get. Right now, that is the most important thing. Moderna and Pfizer have about the same efficacy. Johnson & Johnson, which may be coming on the market soon, has a little bit lower efficacy, although I will note they were doing their trials while all of these stronger variants have been floating around. Moderna and Pfizer have tried to address these variants and how their vaccines will work with them. There may be a booster shot needed. That was floated for Moderna. They seem to have some usage against the different variants, but any of you that are keeping track at home know that every day new articles come out, oftentimes from the same sources that are contradicting each other. So it's difficult to keep track. So the answer is we don't know. I don't know if you can see it at the bottom of the slide or whether it's cut off. Prior or current COVID-19 infections. If you have had a COVID-19 infection, you should still get vaccinated. We don't know how long that native immune system response will protect you for. We estimate it's about 90 days. So I do know some people have been delaying getting their vaccine until 90 days after their first symptom in order so that other people can get the vaccine first who don't have any protection. But it's certainly not necessary, and you should definitely get vaccinated. If you have COVID-19 right now, please wait until you're done with your isolation period. I don't want you infecting anyone else as you're going to get the shot, so we're trying to keep everyone as protected as possible. Anecdotally, if you've had a recent COVID-19 infection, you may feel more side effects when you get that shot because your body is armed and ready for the fight. You can go to the next slide. What are the side effects that you can expect? You should definitely assume your arm is going to hurt. That is seen in 75% of people across the board. And this data is taken from the V-Safe app that the federal government is running right now. It's a great app. When you get your shot, there's a QR code, scan it on your phone. It will send you a link every day that you can go in and tell them your symptoms. Eventually you'll get far enough out that it just checks in on you every week. It knew that I was due for my second dose yesterday, and it sent me a link and I got to fill that out. It's very smart and it's really helping us keep track of these side effects. I do know that about 10 to 15% of people are feeling kind of flu-y afterwards. Some people feel it more after the second dose because, again, their immune system is primed and ready. But I do want to repeat what Dr. Sethi has said. Even after your second dose, we still need to be masking and socially distancing and washing our hands and even getting COVID tests because this is not a perfect protection system. We probably cannot feel comfortable taking away those precautions until about 70% of the population is vaccinated. So we have quite a ways to go, but we are definitely making a great start. So I'm going to throw it back over to Amber.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sethi and Dr. Cole. We are going to move into our question and answer component and want to just take a moment to appreciate you all for your patience as we were testing out some new technology today with the interpretation feature. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We'll do our best to get through as many questions today as possible, and we will start with some of the questions that have been submitted ahead of today's webinar. Dr. Sethi, what do we know about COVID-19 transmission among individuals who have been vaccinated? And related, is it possible to test positive for COVID-19 after having received the vaccine?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And it's a good one, and it comes up a lot. The science is still being worked out to figure out how effective these vaccines are at preventing transmission of this virus. That said, the AstraZeneca vaccine researchers yesterday released a report showing that their vaccine, which is used in the United Kingdom, can cut transmission down by 67%. Now, that study was based on taking swabs of noses of people who are in the clinical trial, and it showed that 67% reduction in finding the virus in the noses of people who received the vaccine compared to placebo. So that's good news. We have to see if that translates to a lowering of cases in the community, but what they found is good news for that vaccine. For Moderna and for Pfizer and other vaccines, those studies hopefully will share their results in the next couple of weeks or months as well. So we're hopeful, but for now we are unsure. Also, I'd say that the effect of the vaccine on transmission will not be 100%. A 67% is not that different from a coin flip. So I think that's exactly why it's still important that we use mitigation and mask use despite being vaccinated. Amber, you also asked about testing positive after the vaccine. Also possible. There's actually a report of healthcare workers who tested positive for COVID a few days after the vaccine, which implies that they probably had COVID before their first dose. We have to expect this. And also, if somebody contracts the virus despite being vaccinated, whether that's one dose or two doses, we can probably expect those individuals to have no symptoms or mild symptoms. And if they do have symptoms, they won't last very long.
Thank you so much. And maybe just one follow-up question to that series. We're getting, how long do we anticipate that the vaccine will be effective for? So do we anticipate this will be a once-a-year vaccine similar to the flu? What do we know to date?
Dr. Cole, do you want to start with that and I can give my thoughts?
We will both be guessing, won't we? I would be basing my answer on a recent pandemic that people may remember, swine flu or H1N1. We went through a very large vaccination process in the fall, and subsequently H1N1 has been included in the flu shot pretty much every year since then. So there's not data to know whether it was needed. We just went ahead and did that preemptively. We won't have any kind of information about the length of the immune response until quite a few months later. But rest assured, that data will be collected, and this will probably be integrated into a standard flu shot.
Yeah, I'll also comment that the platform for these RNA vaccines allows for editing of the RNA. So if we find some new variants in the future for which the vaccine is not effective, the platform is now available and the RNA can be tweaked and edited so that it can sort of create a spike protein that represents the ones that are in our community. And the vaccine may very well, as Dr. Cole said, be similar to influenza, where we have to have an update. For that, we do every year. And for this one, we may also have updates in the future.
Thank you both. Dr. Cole, you mentioned you would talk about pregnant women later on in the presentation. I think now would be a great time to address COVID-19 vaccination amongst women who are pregnant or breastfeeding or recently postpartum.
For those of you keeping score at home, it seems like everybody's changing their opinion practically daily. I can tell you what's up to date as of this week. When you get an emergency use authorization, as I mentioned, the FDA wants to look at risks versus benefits. We do not have any population level data for pregnant women. They were not included in the trials. Therefore, all risk and benefit assessments need to be done on an individual level. The CDC has had this position for many months now. The WHO came out a little bit more strongly against pregnant women getting vaccinated, but recently has realigned with the CDC. There are quite a few signs that show there will be some benefit. A study out of Penn last Friday showed that pregnant women who had COVID-19 did end up passing immune cells across the placenta to their fetuses. And when the babies were born, they had a measurable immune response. Babies don't actually have an immune response of their own until they're about 6 months old. So we know that all of those cells came from the mother. And that was about 75% of the infants. So that is a good sign. We also know that pregnant women have tended to get more severe cases of COVID-19, indicating that there is a significant benefit to protecting these women against a life-threatening disease. The problem is that we don't have any known risk to hold it up against. So that's why it's going to be a very individual decision. Lactating women have less of a risk just because the baby has already been born. Same idea of sending across, this time through the breast milk, those antibodies to their baby. So both the CDC and the WHO are more supportive of that population.
And you had shared a little bit in your presentation, Dr. Cole, with regards to ongoing studies amongst children. Could you just maybe reiterate some things that we should keep in mind, or perhaps a timeline on when we might anticipate to have approvals for vaccines for kids?
I wish I could give you a day. What I will say is that teen studies are enrolling right now. If you are interested and in a location where one is going on and your teenager is willing to get the jab, that will be helpful information that will be available to us within a few months. For younger children, it's going to take time to roll out. We'll go to 6 to 12-year-olds and then 2 to 6-year-olds. And they have to start with smaller doses. It takes a little bit longer to figure out what the risks and the benefits are. So we're hoping that by the beginning of next school year, we'll have more concrete data. But at the moment, getting schools back to normal is why teachers have been included in 1B, and really hoping that that transmission component can help, the vaccines can help prevent some transmission at schools. So it's a difficult to predict the timeline on that one. It's still ongoing.
I recently learned, I heard you reference the word jab, and recently learned of the Fauci ouchie as perhaps a different phrase that we could be using that feels maybe a little less painful than that.
I will adopt that immediately.
Wonderful. A couple of times you've both alluded to the fact that we are learning more every day, and that perhaps the messaging is changing one day from the next. And perhaps you could just talk a little bit to science and the way science and research evolves within the context of the pandemic, and what we should take away from that with regards to COVID-19 vaccination in particular.
I can start by saying I think we all are sort of inundated with COVID-19 news and information 24/7, and it's been a year now. We've spent all last year talking about cases and hospitalizations and deaths and mitigation, and now we're adding vaccines to that conversation, so it's even more information. I will say that I personally, because it feels very overwhelming to digest all the information that's coming out, I train myself to take a step back and not sort of jump on new information too quickly. If something seems unique or different or surprising, I wait a few days to see if there are more studies that come out, if other experts are commenting before I shape an opinion. It keeps my emotions sort of in check. I'll also comment that our society, I feel, has a tendency to move to the next topic that's brought up related to this pandemic. And right now that's vaccines. I want to emphasize that we should never forget about mitigation, that if our society for 1 month wore masks, and we all did it, we would not have COVID transmission in our community, 0. And the vaccine is going to take a year to roll out. We could actually rid ourselves, our society, of COVID in 1/10 the time if we just do what has always been told to us of wearing masks and physically distancing. So as much as I'm making this answer very long, I'm sorry, but I feel that with all the new information that comes out, it's really important that we stay focused on what we know always to be true.
Yeah, I will definitely echo the inundation of information is overwhelming. I feel it too. But I will say it's not unexpected. A lot of times scientists may sound wishy-washy, but it's because science is iterative and we test and interrogate every level of knowledge that we have. And sometimes we find new information on those cycles of interrogation that do change information. I think we're all aware of how science and politics don't always have the same messaging strategy. So that can also lead to some difficulties, but it's to be expected. And this is nothing new. People have been fighting about vaccines. There is a famous Supreme Court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, all the way back from 1905. So we are not over here reinventing the wheel. This is very expected. It does not mean that it's not also extremely tiresome. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. This vaccine is a much better way of getting to herd immunity than if we were to allow the virus to get us there itself. A lot less people will die this way. But I do know that it can be painful to watch the bumps as the rollout process occurs.
Appreciate those reminders as well with regards to some of the personal prevention practices that we can all play in stopping or slowing the spread of COVID-19. We've got a number of questions coming in around which groups of individuals we might anticipate to be eligible next. Dr. Cole, could you walk us through sort of the phasing of the distribution and who we might anticipate to be prioritized next?
Absolutely. So in Wisconsin on March 1, we are going to anticipate the rest of phase 1B, which I mentioned educators. It's also going to be Medicaid long-term care programs, public-facing essential workers in certain categories like 911 operators, utility workers, public transit, food chain workers, also people who live in congregate settings. There is talk about, so it's difficult when you label things because people are wanting to know, is there going to be a 1C? Are we jumping right to phase 2? Does it really matter what we call these things? I know in Wisconsin, we try very hard to be polite, which is why we are trying to put as many people in phase 1 as possible, which is lovely, but not always the easiest to follow. We are definitely still concerned about other essential workers that have not been included in that first category, specifically manufacturing. It's a very large sector of the population here in Wisconsin, but there definitely have been outbreaks seen. And of course, people with high-risk medical conditions. We've been approaching that by age so far, but we are aware that many younger people have diagnoses as well. And in fact, having a diagnosis is a form of privilege. So the committees are very attuned to equity issues. Eventually, we will get to the general public, 16 to 64, without high-risk medical conditions. That may be called phase 2. I don't know what numbering system we will be at that point. And then after that, we will begin the realm of children. So it will continue to roll down by age. And I'm not exactly sure the timeline on that. I can tell you it's estimated March 1 for phase 1B. A lot of this is dependent on how quickly we can move through each of the phases, which is dependent on how quickly Moderna and Pfizer can put vaccine into vials. Even as of yesterday, Moderna is begging the FDA to let them put more doses in each vial because they think that literally the process of putting a label on the glass is the limiting factor, and they want to get as much out there as possible. So all hands are on deck to try to get us through as many phases as quickly as possible.
And as you shared in your presentation, the logistics of distribution alone are a massive undertaking. I do want to be cognizant of time. We were coming up at the 1 o'clock hour. We have a number of questions that we have not yet had a chance to address. And so what I think I might offer is we could work with presenters and perhaps get some quick answers to those Q&A that we could share out in response to the webinar, along with the recording materials in the next week or weeks to come. With that, I want to just give our presenters a moment to share a top 1 or 2 takeaway message that you want to make sure that our participants leave with today. If there's 1 or 2 things that in all of today's conversations you want folks to hear, what is that message?
I'll say, my mic is not muted, so I'll say that stay positive. Be resilient, be patient, and be hopeful. We've got a vaccine that's highly effective, 2 vaccines, highly effective, others coming up. I feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel.
My message is going to be that vaccination is the safest way through to the end of the pandemic. It is by no means a perfect way, so we all need to maintain the vigilance that I'm sure we are all suffering fatigue around. But I agree with the sentiment of hope. We have a path, and it's exciting.
Well, thank you to both of our presenters. Thank you to our interpreters who joined us today. And thank you to all of you participants who are with us. For those who are able to hang on for a brief moment, we do have a demographics poll that we'd like you to respond to. This information is used to ensure our programming is reaching a diversity of audiences and to fulfill our obligations as a recipient of federal funding. You reserve the right to not provide this demographic information should you choose not to, and please prefer not to respond. Thank you all again, and we look forward to having you join our second webinar in this series, which will be focused on communication strategies around the COVID-19 vaccination, and outreach materials will be distributed very shortly with the registration information. And thank you again.